Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Classical Wisdom webinar dedicated to the topic of plagiarism. My name is Anya Leonard. I'm the founder and director of Classical Wisdom. If you're new to us, we are a site dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds, and we have a free newsletter and memberships. But one of the reasons we also do this is to bring up events and discussions of webinars, often on timely topics. So we can kind of connect how wisdom of the ancient world, how knowledge of philosophy can be really applicable in our modern age. And to that extent, I'm very pleased to introduce our excellent speakers. We have Dr. James Hankins, professor of history at Harvard University and an intellectual historian specializing in the Italian Renaissance and the author of many books, including Virtue, Politics, Soulcraft, and Statecraft. And it was his recent article in the Wall Street Journal that prompted this conversation, and James generously offered his time and also suggested we reach out to Peter Scott Adamson, professor of philosophy in late antiquity and the Islamic world at the Ludwig Maximilian University at Munich, as well as professor of ancient and medieval philosophy at King's College in London. He's also the host of the weekly podcast, History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, and author of Don't Think for Yourself, Authority and Belief in Medieval Philosophy, which is a great title. So thank you, both Jim and Peter, for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having me. We're very, very welcome to be here.
Now, we are prompted onto this conversation about these recent allegations of plagiarism that has been sort of occurring in the highest levels of institutions, learning, education in America and in abroad. But the history of plagiarism is quite ancient, as most things often are. So maybe we should get to the basics of it, to the ancient history onwards. How far back does plagiarism go?
Jim, do you want to start?
Well, I think for as long as people have been writing books, there's been plagiarism. The word is an ancient word. It's Latin plagiarios, which means a kidnapper. In Roman law, a kidnapper is distinct from a slaver because he kidnaps free people. But the word was used very early on to mean literary theft. I think Marshall is the first example. Maybe Peter knows earlier ones. The ancients, of course, did not have the means we have to find out plagiarisms. But in closed literary circles like Marshall, he was aware of people ripping him off. The point I was trying to make in the Wall Street Journal article was that plagiarism, though it's been recognized as a kind of theft for a long time, is a peculiar salience in the research university. And I was writing about the Claudine Gay thing, obviously, and it made it quite different from the use of authorities in the Middle Ages. And Peter and I got into an email conversation about this because he's a great expert on medieval use of authority. You mentioned his book, which I mentioned in my Wall Street Journal, just to sort of bring up the point about authorities. And I think, but anyway, I think of plagiarism as one of the major sins of the research university and of science in general, of different kinds of science in general. Whereas in the ancient world, plagiarism was not so essential to the academic enterprise. In fact, the academic enterprise as it emerges in the Middle Ages is much more concerned with authority and the use of authority and the interpretation of authorities than they are with originality, the way the modern research university is. So authority, I've been toying with the generalization. I'm waiting for Peter to correct me on this because he knows much more about it than I do. That the great sin of the research university is plagiarism, and the great sin of the medieval scholastic world is forgery. So I'll let Peter take me apart on that.
Yeah, no, I like that actually. So I mean, I've been thinking about this ever since you invited me, and I think it's striking to me how rarely this comes up actually in ancient and medieval philosophy, at least. And then I was thinking about like what are the earliest cases of plagiarism that I can think of. So you mentioned Martial, but what I'm talking about is plagiarism kind of in the modern day sense, like one scientist or intellectual steals another's work
Mhm.
and maybe presents it as their own. And in a sense, I think that's actually a very modern phenomenon, and maybe originates more in the period that Jim is an expert on than that I'm an expert on, and for some good reasons. So first of all, something that I tell my students all the time, and that's easy to forget, even if you work on the ancient and medieval world, it's easy to forget that all text until the printing press is handwritten. So even the very idea of plagiarizing in a context where everything is handwritten and every text is a unique handmade artifact, although it's clearly not an incomprehensible idea. So we have these examples of like Roman poets stealing lines from each other, for example. But the reason why that's possible is that that's actually quite an unusual situation, right? Because Roman poets were prominent. Poetry is short, so it's easy to disseminate. It's memorable. It has meter or rhyme, right? Whereas if you imagine, like, let's say, the idea of plagiarizing someone else's proof for the existence of God or the immortality of the soul, I'm not aware of any pre-modern example of that. And in fact, it's kind of an like first of all, how would you know who was first, right? So if someone holds up a piece of parchment and says, "Look, I've got that already written on a piece of parchment," right? So that's not a
Yeah.
claim to priority, right? Whereas even an early, sorry, go ahead, Jim.
I mean, but one of the points would be is that they're very proud of borrowing from the earlier guys. I mean, you wouldn't expect a medieval like Thomas Aquinas to be citing gratefully the works of Islamic scientists like Avicenna, who uses all the time, and Maimonides, who uses all the time. But he's proud of it, which is really remarkable when you consider that the brothers of these people who are studying in medieval universities are often the Holy Land fighting Muslims. You know, there's wars going on, and in the university, that's not happening. But people are very proud of using the authorities, and as you write very well in your various books, the manipulation or the ability to interpret authorities, the ability to make them bear on particular problems is really one of the great skills of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, that's definitely right. I
You
mean,
know,
so I think we need to get into a much deeper conversation about like what was their attitude towards originality. So we can talk about that. But I wanted to make a simpler point just to kind of start, which is that to some extent, to have our modern notion of plagiarism, you need to have the material possibility of even claiming priority to a certain set of ideas or discovery or text. So I was thinking back of everything I've covered in my podcast, and I think the first thing that comes to mind is actually from the middle of the 16th century. So this is Girolamo Cardano published a solution to cubic equations. Jim probably knows more about this than I do, which he actually says this was discovered by Niccolo Tartaglia, and he wouldn't want me to publish it, but I'm going to do it anyway. Or at least Tartaglia didn't want him to publish it, right? And he says, well, and then Cardano said, well, actually, someone else had already discovered it independently anyway, so it doesn't really matter that I'm repeating Tartaglia's solution, right? So here you can see that people are starting to have interest in priority, right? So who discovered something?
yeah,
Another really interesting example, which comes from only a little bit later, so it's the end of the 16th century, is the contrast between two of the great scientists of the late 16th century, Thomas Harriot, and I bet none of you have heard of Thomas Harriot except Jim. Maybe some of you who are experts on science. So one of the true giants of late 16th century science, and his contemporary Galileo, who you've all heard of. So here's the difference between them. Galileo was scratching around for patronage and support through his career. And so he made a big deal about publicizing all of his findings on things like the physics of falling bodies. Thomas Harriot had a kind of sinecure with a patron in England who sort of set him up with a scientific laboratory and all the support he could want. He discovers the sine law of refraction. He anticipates or sort of simultaneously duplicates, or maybe even a little bit earlier, Galileo's discoveries on falling bodies. Supposedly, according to a letter his friend wrote to Harriot, Harriot figured out that planets move in ellipses. And the reason we know this is that the friend writes him a letter and says, "Oh, I see Kepler is announcing that planets move in ellipses. This could have been your discovery if you had just told everyone about it when you figured it out," right? But what Harriot did was he wrote all this stuff down in manuscripts, in other words, on handwritten documents, literally sort of stuck it in his drawer, desk drawer, or maybe made a few copies and gave them to his friends, right? And so here you're really seeing the very beginnings of this, right? So Harriet is someone who hasn't yet kind of figured out or hasn't prioritized maybe the use of printed texts to lay claim to a discovery. But on the other hand, his friends are actually telling him off for failing to do it. And simultaneously, someone down in Italy with the very same projects is making great hay of the fact that he's the one who's discovering these things. So I think that's that. So when you think about like, when did this become a thing, our thing, like the Claudine Gay thing, it became a thing somewhere between the printing press and 1600. So it's a 16th century phenomenon, in my opinion.
Now, can I maybe add in just so that, because we do have a few examples of plagiarism sort of in the very ancient world. The first century Roman architect, Vitruvius, spoke about this in his seventh book of De Architectura, that earlier writers deserve our thanks. Those, on the contrary, deserve our reproaches, who steal the writings of such men and publish them as their own. But also, as Michael Fontaine is put into the comments section, that there's also a famous example of it with regards to the eunuch. I mean, he's written, maybe I should read it out, because the discussion of clope, theft, plagiarism, this affliction metastasized even by the great Meander, while Aristophanes of Byzantium exposed him greatly in the parallel extracts from him and those he plagiarized. I mean, so I do think we have some ancient examples, but then it kind of, I mean, you guys are much more familiar with sort of the Middle Ages, that I wonder at what point does the interaction of plagiarism and the kind of institutions of learning that we had interact, and like, as you say, the ideas of the attitudes towards originality. I mean, maybe this is something that existed in the ancient world, sort of went away and then kind of came back again, as often is the case.
Yeah, I think there's a major change in the 17th century, because there you have people starting to fight over credit. And the famous example is Leibniz and Newton about calculus, right? And they had followings in their universities, and in Leibniz's case, in his research library, people claiming that priority, we did this first. Now, in the case of calculus, I'm not sure what the technological payoff are. One of the things that's entering into science now is the idea of that science can lead to technological payoffs. And you find this as early as the Italian Renaissance, and writers like Leonardo da Vinci, going up to Galileo himself, artists, engineers, and what do they call them? Geometricians, they call them. So people who work for princes, and the princes are founding academies. The academies are often have very practical purposes. The Florentine Academy is very involved in ballistics. The Grand Duke of Florence was interested in Tuscany, sorry, was interested in having guns that could demolish enemy walls, and they needed mathematics for that. But in the 17th century, you have a lot of interest in governments in finding technological payoffs for science. And the famous example is Francis Bacon, who wants to make science, what's the phrase? Improve man's estate. I've forgotten the exact wording. But then Boyle, who is a disciple of Francis Bacon, comes up with lists of things that he wants the Royal Society, which is a research institution, to examine. So he some of the lists include things like the prolongation of life. We want to research how to prolong life, how to recover youth, how to get new teeth, how to fly, how to swim underwater, and how to make armor that's light, and how to get a ship that will sail without not can't be sunk or work underwater. So that they're thinking about these technological breakthroughs of the future. These are prophetic texts in lots of ways, and they want science. They want to apply science or the study of science for these technological breakthroughs, many of which have economic or military applications. So once you have that situation going, I think that's what really is behind, from my point of view anyway, is behind the central importance that plagiarism and academic honesty plays in modern research universities, which are really, modern research universities really only go back to, well, early 20th century in America, late 19th century in Germany. The Germans are very interested in scientific applications that will, especially in chemistry, they're interested in explosives. And in America, I think the technological payoffs of universities really get going with the atomic bomb in 1930s and 40s. And then after the Second World War, that's when you have the great flourishing of the research university. But in that context, it's very important to know who is responsible for a scientific breakthrough. It's no longer a question of ego or of wounded authorship, but now you've got real money in play. You've got governments that want to spend their money wisely. Well, I shouldn't say that, because governments never want to spend their money wisely, but they at least want something for their money. They don't want to give money to the wrong people and wrong institutions, and institutions start to boast of all of their achievements and to fight over who got it first, right? So that is why plagiarism assumes this important role in modern universities. This is my view anyway. I'm happy to have anyone contest it. And I think it ultimately goes back to the 17th century academies of science, maybe the 16th century Florentine Academy, these princely and aristocratic groups that were trying to apply science to the so-called the betterment of man's estate, or the relief. That's the quote. This is Bacon quote, that science should be oriented for the relief of man's estate, to make men have better lives.
Now, I
I think
think
that's all. Oh, sorry. I was
no,
just
no,
gonna say, I think that's all
go ahead,
really
Peter.
important. So the idea that knowledge is an economic asset is really key here. And actually, maybe the commonality between like the ancient cases you mentioned, like Vitruvius, for example, or Martial, and the Renaissance case, is that there is an economic incentive to claim originality or at least brilliance, namely to secure patronage, like I was saying with Galileo. I mean, I guess you can think of pre-modern examples where knowledge actually has a huge economic consequence. So you can think of like Greek fire in Byzantium, that's a protected secret. Or another example might be how to make silk, which is a protected technology in China. But even these are not, it's not like one scientist, the guy who we don't know who invented Greek fire, as far as I'm aware, right? So what I think what's special about this, I would say even the late 16th century, but certainly the 17th century. So if you think about, for example, the Royal Society, the furious competition between those scientists, Newton and the others, right, to lay claim to various discoveries, that has to do very much with an incentive structure, right? So until you have incentive structures for claiming priority, it's really just about, as you were saying, Jim, it's about sort of like wounded pride or something, right? Like I would quite like to have everyone praising me for that. Thank you very much, because I wrote it. But actually, I think a combination. So what I would say about the pre-modern situation is that you don't, as I was saying before, you don't necessarily even have the material conditions for verifying priority anyway, right? Because all you've got is individually written manuscripts, like I said. And second of all, you don't necessarily have an incentive structure. I mean, there are incentive structures in the medieval university that even reward originality, but the incentive structures have to do with attracting students. And you don't do that by discovering something. You do that by being an interesting teacher. So, for example, I mean, people have a tendency to think that medieval scholastics were authority bound and trying their best to not be interesting, so to speak, like just try to stay within the tradition. But actually, to some extent, that's the reverse of the case, because in situations where the masters are making money by attracting young students, someone like Peter Abelard, for example, who's actually working just before the rise of the proper university, but he's working in these schools, right? He's competing. We know that he was competing with other logicians for students. And we know that he engages in diatribes and polemics against other logicians who he sort of says are idiots. He tells us in his autobiography that he was valued as this brilliant teacher who could attract these students. I'm sure he was a brilliant teacher. He's certainly a brilliant logician and philosopher. So that's the kind of originality or sharpness of mind that could be incentivized in the medieval context. But until the printing press, you don't have like, oh, look, I'm the one who discovered this engineering law or this metaphysical argument.
Yeah.
Look, it says right there, like the date of publication on the printed book, right?
And maybe I could add something to that, because first of all, in the case of Abelard, having more students really directly means having more money, because the bachelor is standing at the door of the lecture room with his bag, and the students have to put the coin in as they come into the class. That's what we need in the modern university, that would separate the wheat from the chaff. But also, there is a payoff of sorts for Abelard's students, because he's teaching them skills that they need. Medieval government is conciliar government, church government, state government, conciliar government, and you gain power in those institutions by being able to make arguments. If you're even in royal courts, they have councils, and even if they're only consultative councils, you still can get power when the king calls on you and says, "What do you think?" And you say, "Well, this is what I think. The authorities A, B, and C say this, they seem to conflict, but we can make them agree, or we can apply them to this particular problem. And if you do that very well, you will gain influence in those institutions. The same way any committee that anyone is on today, the person who speaks well, who speaks cogently, who has the facts, that person will succeed. So I don't want to give you the impression that medieval universities don't have some kind of benefit. The study that you undertake in medieval universities don't have benefit to people, but it's not the same as the structure of incentives that we find in modern research universities.
Now, just to add in again, Mike has very helpfully added for the classics angle that the economic motif did play a role for ancient Roman playwrights who were competing for sort of Roman government contracts. So, I mean, there would be definitely elements. And again, when you think of the playwrights and the festivals, the competition that was extremely high and important if you won and kind of earned the great prizes. So I think that economic element of it is really good insight. I'd love to talk a bit more about the role of authority in sort of institutions throughout the ages, because I think it's something we've touched upon a bit, but like how important was it to sort of follow, I guess, blindly your teachers, or I mean, in that regard of were students expected to think originally or to copy? Was that sort of integral to how the medieval and Renaissance universities were set up?
So I think they start them out by copying, but remember that medieval students at least in the European context, were very young. So you're coming to the university when you're 13 or 14, right? You're trying to learn Latin at that point. So we shouldn't imagine that we're talking about adults who are university students in the first instance. Um, I mean, so now we're getting to something I wrote a whole book about. So I mean, I may have too much to say about this. So if so, then stop me. So the first thing I would say is that the situation is rather different in the Islamic world than in the Latin Christian world. Partially because there's no church. So I mean, there are theologians, but there, apart from some early like 9th century attempts of secular authorities to impose doctrinal restrictions on what Muslim theologians could say, which basically failed. In general, there's a very kind of open situation in terms of what you can say. And there's contrary to popular conception, there's essentially no intellectual persecution in the Islamic medieval worlds. So by medieval, I mean up to like the 12th century, let's say 12th, 13th century. Or in fact, even thereafter, although there's somewhat more control in like early modern Islam, like in the Ottoman Empire, for example, because they start to have these sort of state apparatuses that make that possible. And in fact, so first of all, there's no centralized authority that could try to impose orthodoxy, insofar as that could even be a thing. There's a scholar named Frank Griffel at Yale who wrote a book about the emergence of orthodoxy in Islamic culture, in which he argued that it doesn't really even come along until around the turn of the 12th century with Al-Ghazali, who's a theologian who says that his predecessor Avicenna, Ibn Sina, the greatest philosopher of the Islamic world, was a heretic and should have been killed for his teachings. And this was kind of a new idea that I mean, he was already dead, so it was a pretty idle threat. But Ghazali, at least he's sort of the first person to say, well, here this person with his philosophical views has stepped outside of acceptable belief. But that's, again, very rare, and there are no mechanisms for enforcing it, right? So that's one thing to know about the Islamic situation. Another thing to know is that there's a word which is very central in the discussion of my book, which is actually a very nice word to know. It's taqlid, and people usually translate it as uncritical acceptance of authority. And this is not a nice thing to say about someone. So if you say that someone's engaging in taqlid, what you mean is that they're not thinking for themselves. They're not critically reflecting on their beliefs. They're just taking their beliefs over from someone else. For example, their parents, right? So Ghazali, again, is relevant here. He talks about having a kind of crisis when he was a young man, where he's worried about the fact that maybe he's only a Muslim because his parents raised him Muslim. And he feels he has to do better than this. He has to sort of convince himself that Muhammad was a genuine prophet, right? And at least amongst intellectuals, it was kind of generally assumed that any intellectual worth their salt would not engage in taqlid. They would think through everything on their own. But it's important to bear in mind that doesn't mean originality. So, for example, it could mean working through a set of arguments. Let's say the question again is proving the existence of God, right? So taqlid would mean you only believe in God because someone told you that God exists. You can avoid taqlid by working through some classic arguments for the existence of God and seeing that they work, right? You don't have to invent your own proof of the existence of God. You can just see, oh yeah, these proofs work. I understand them. Fine, right? God exists. Or I acknowledge that Muhammad was a genuine prophet because I see that there are good reasons to believe it. Again, you don't have to come up with new reasons. You just have to understand that there are good reasons, right? And this plays out in jurisprudence, it plays out in theology, and it plays out in philosophy. So the intellectual self-conception in the Islamic world is really of a kind of intellectual elite who think of themselves as reflective, autonomous, rational agents. And often they distinguish themselves from sort of hoi polloi. And these are the people who are allowed to engage in taqlid, at least on many matters, because it would be dangerous for them to try to do this because they might get confused, the intellectuals think. But actually, sometimes they even say that all Muslims should at least be able to prove the existence of God, right? So every Muslim should be able to, unless they're like, somehow like incapable of it because of whatever reason, right? But any kind of normal adult Muslim should be able to at least kind of work through a reason to believe in God, because that will make sure that their faith in God is unshakable. You see this idea in the theological literature, and I think that is different from what we see in Latin Christendom. I mean, I don't know whether that rings bells for Jem in terms of things that we see on the Latin Christian side, but I think that's what we see in the Islamic context, at least.
Yes, well, the existence of orthodoxy does make things different. But I see on the Latin side the same sort of thing, which is that authorities are greatly respected, not because they're authorities, but because they're very good at explaining things. So the reason you read Aristotle or Augustine or Avicenna or Maimonides is because, and the reason why they're authorities is that they explain things very well and they help you to think. The same way we read great books today, they help us to think, right? Now, what's different in the West is that they do have a more rigid structure of authorities. There's a hierarchy. And the Christian authorities are higher than pagan authorities. And let's say the top Christian authorities are church councils and decrees of popes, edicts of popes, and things, and the Bible. And then slightly after that come church fathers, and then you get down into the pagan authors. Ideally, if you're a good interpreter of authority, you can make them all agree with each other. Right? That shows tremendous skill to show how Aristotle proves the existence of God. But occasionally the authorities, just won't. The famous medieval saying is, authority has a waxen nose, meaning you can kind of push it in this direction, you can push it in that direction. But once in a while, it's just clear that pagans are not going to be compatible with Christians. So the famous case is Aquinas and the eternity of the world, because it's quite clear that Aristotle believes in the eternity of the world. He makes arguments for it in the metaphysics, and Christians believe in creation. So Aquinas is an Aristotelian, so what he ends up doing is not showing that Aristotle is wrong, but showing that Aristotle's arguments are not demonstrative. So he's leaving room for faith. So in that way, he actually does this using Aristotelian language, Aristotelian arguments to disprove Aristotle's conclusion. So he's being a good Aristotelian, but just disagreeing with the master on this point, and maybe you can conceive it as a kind of friendly amendment. But authorities are valuable because they help us to think. And so this is where we get into the whole issue of forgery and hiding one's own opinion under the opinions of authorities. There are modern research on St. Augustine, for example, has shown there are literally hundreds of letters and sermons that have been forged and passed under the name, not necessarily forged, they pass under the name of Augustine. So maybe a medieval monk likes this particular argument, this particular letter, and he thinks it really should be remembered, but he knows that it won't be remembered if it goes under the name of Johannes Minimus. So he puts the name of Augustine on top, and then it gets included in the corpus of Augustine's letters. And then, only in the 20th century they start to figure out that a lot of this stuff is not really Augustine. So it's a way of, and sometimes people are bad actors, that they have heretical ideas that they think are really stronger than the Orthodox ideas, so they put them in the corpus of some well-known Christian authority. But there is an attitude that, and one shouldn't also forget about humility, because some of these people are monks, they're serious Christians, they don't want it, they want to they don't want to take credit for things. The opposite of the way we think in the modern academy. I'm trying to think. There's a Dominican scholar of the late 16th century who worked in the Vatican Library. Many of his books are there. And my late wife, years ago, discovered that he was ghostwriting a lot of Augustin, and he was ghostwriting a lot of works by other people because he was simply too humble to take. Well, that was what was said about him, that he was too humble to take credit. So he would write these works and then pass them under other people's names. So maybe that's something that shouldn't be forgotten either. But then there's the virtuous forgery of the Renaissance. Can we talk about that?
Yes, please. I think it's a fascinating topic. I don't know, Peter, if you want to jump in as well, but it's an interesting phenomenon that I don't think many people are sort of aware that it was so prevalent in the medieval time period.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking of this really as a kind of Renaissance phenomenon. And what a virtuous forgery is when you write under the name of an ancient author. Right. So the first famous case is Lambattista Alberti, who is the model for the Renaissance man by Jacob Burckhardt. He's the example of Renaissance man. And he's a famous artist engineer and does many things, leaps small buildings with a single bound and so forth. He, at the very young age, forged a Roman comedy called the Philodoxus, and he passed under the name of Lepidus. And this is like 1422, I believe, in the early 1420s. And then the thing circulates, it gets copied. This is a period when they're rediscovering a lot of ancient texts that have been lost in monasteries, or they're bringing them into Florence and into classical libraries, creating classical libraries. So people latch on to this. Here's another ancient comedy. So 15 years go by, and then Alberti suddenly announces, "It's mine, I wrote it." After everyone has praised this great work of classical literature, which has been rediscovered, he then says, no, I wrote it, and here's my draft copy. So what happens is that everyone admires Alberti because he's as good as an ancient. Since the ancients are the gold standard for writing, everyone says, wow, Alberti must be a fabulous writer if he can be taken for a classic. And there's another very famous example of this in the 16th century, as a historian named Carlos Sigonio, who forged a lost text of Cicero, the Consolation of Cicero, that he wrote when his daughter died. It's a very famous work. Augustine talks about it in the Consolation, but it was lost. So Sigonio says, I found it, and here it is. I'm publishing it. Everyone can now read the Consolation of Cicero, but it was a forgery. And it was expected that the readers would figure out that it's a forgery because it's also a centone. It's also a collection of quotations from other works of Cicero. Right. So he kind of pastes them all together and makes this virtuous forgery. There was a big debate, and people are denouncing him for the forgery, and he's kind of basking in all this debate about his forgery because he knows that the conclusion is going to be, wow, this guy Carlos Sigonio can write like Cicero, right? And there's also examples in art. There's a famous example of young Michelangelo who does an early sculpture that was rediscovered only a few years ago. It's now in the Met in New York City, and it's called The Young Archer. But this is supposedly a work that Michelangelo was passing off as an ancient work. And the goal was that people would praise it, and then he would emerge from the shadow and say, no, it's not ancient, it's mine. And he was advised to do this by his patron. They had recently been digging up fake ancient literature in Viterbo and other places, digging up fake ancient architecture and so forth. And so this is part of the whole idea of the virtuous forgery, that you prove that you're as good as the ancient by faking a work of antiquity. But that's sort of the opposite of what we're talking about. It's like reverse plagiarism in a way, isn't it? Well, I don't know if it falls in, it's a separate category, but I think it shows the difference between the way pre-modern people think about authority and exemplarity, and the way that, in the modern world, it's such emphasis on originality, on being original, doing something that's never been done before.
Virtuous forgery almost seems like clever marketing.
Yeah.
Yeah, Peter, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say that too, that forgery is the opposite of plagiarism, right? So instead of passing off someone else's words as your own, you pass off your own words as someone else's, right? And
Yeah.
maybe just to make sure that they get mentioned because they deserve to be, there's the most famous medieval forgery, which is the donation of Constantine, which I was going to mention already, but someone put it in the chat as well. So that was unmasked by Lorenzo Valla, one of the great humanists, and was a huge, cause célèbre when he did that. And he uses philological methods to do that, right? So he looks into, is it plausible? I mean, is it psychologically plausible that Constantine would have given all this land to the church? No. But also he says, look, the terminology here is not historically plausible, right? Another example that we must mention is the Pseudo Dionysius, which is much earlier than the cases you were just mentioning.
Yeah.
So this could be considered a forgery. So this is a late ancient Christian Platonist who writes, I mean, maybe you could say he's writing with the persona of a biblical figure who actually saw Jesus and is mentioned fleetingly in the Bible, named Dionysius. And his motivations are extremely unclear, but why ever he did, but he even says, you remember when we were standing there seeing Christ, right? So he really adopts this kind of character. And one way to read that is that he's passing it off. So he's pretending to be someone he isn't. And this convinced people for centuries. So it was actually one of the authorities for the medievals, even for people like Aquinas, was the Pseudo-Dionysius, what we call the Pseudo-Dionysius, but of course they just called the Dionysian corpus, so several works by this guy. And this was a way that Neoplatonic ideas were sort of smuggled into the Christian mainstream.
Yeah.
Something else I wanted to say about
it was a copy of Proclus, wasn't it? I mean, Pseudo-Dionysius, a lot of it was taken from Proclus, isn't that right?
Yeah. So actually, the way it was eventually unmasked is that Dionysius's explanation of evil is lifted wholesale. That's another irony, is that he kind of plagiarizes his account of evil, his Theodicy, from Proclus, right? And then when people notice that obviously Proclus lived a lot later than Jesus, right? Because he's a late antique Platonist, right?
Yeah.
So, whatever, 400 or 500 years too late. And so when people noticed that, that was the smoking gun evidence, although people had suspected it before that. But I mean, I think that there's a more general phenomenon here, which is, so nowadays we are sort of taught from being undergraduates that, first of all, when in doubt, say where you got everything. But the general policy is, if you're using someone else's words or ideas, you quote them, right? So this is what Claudine Gay did wrong. So she sometimes used little bits of tech. I mean, this is mostly what she did wrong. There might be some cases that are more egregious than this, but she used, as far as I understand it at least, she used like phrasing, sometimes several sentences, without saying where she got it, right? And that's something we tell even undergraduates not to do, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, obviously that's very different from something we actually had. There's been a couple of cases of this in the medieval philosophy scholarly world during my career, where people did things like publishing entire articles under their names that they didn't write at all.
Yeah.
Right? And she hasn't been accused of anything like that. So you can see there's kind of a spectrum of possible plagiarism. But I think what the kind of the sort of philosophically and historically interesting question is, when and why would you mention someone's name when you use some text that you got from them, right? And I think that,
or ideas, ideas are even harder.
Or even ideas, yeah. But I think, I mean, as historians, it's a lot easier if you can find verbatim quotation, right? Because then you know, like obviously as historians, we have to know where they got it. And if it's verbatim quotation, then that makes it easier. And so I think an interesting case here, to stick with Neoplatonism for a second, would be Simplicius. So Simplicius is again, not exactly a household name, but anyone who's ever studied any Greek philosophy has indirectly benefited from Simplicius, because he's a late ancient commentator on Aristotle who's already worrying that what for him are already extremely ancient texts, because they're 1,000 or more years old, right, are becoming inaccessible as Christianity has come in. He's a pagan, right? So he does things like commenting on Aristotle's physics. And when Aristotle mentions Parmenides, Simplicius says, oh, here's Parmenides' poem, or part of it. And that's why we have Parmenides' poem, right? So so there we have someone who's quoting and naming the source, because that's the whole point, right? Then we have another case in Simplicius where he's attacking a Christian philosopher from the same school named Philoponus, John Philoponus. And he quotes him verbatim and says that he's quoting him because he wants to attack him. And in fact, he even says at one point, I will quote his words verbatim so that people will see how foolish he is. Right? So the opposite of quoting Parmenides or Empedocles or whoever, right? So here you have him quoting people because their words are extremely valuable or extremely bad. But then the middle case, where he's just kind of recycling, so this is more like a case of academic plagiarism. He'll do things like commenting on Aristotle and just borrowing lots and lots of the material from earlier commentaries from people like Alexander of Aphrodisias or Porphyry. And he may or may not tell you that. And in fact, there are even bits of his commentaries where scholars still disagree how much of it is Alexander and how much of it is Simplicius. By the way, there's a good book about all this by my old friend Han Bautisen, who wrote a book about Simplicius and his way of putting together commentaries. So I think what that shows you is that actually, at least in some pre-modern contexts, and this would be a very important pre-modern context, so the Aristotelian commentary tradition, not mentioning someone's name is the default. So you mention the source if you have a reason to mention the source. So it's the opposite of us, right? So we think by all means, mention the source. You might get in trouble if you don't, right? Whereas his policy is, well, if I'm just recycling material for my commentary, Alexander understood Aristotle, so I'll just quote his commentary. He explained it well, so why should I change anything, right? And he may or may not say this is Alexander's words. He's more likely to say that it's Alexander if he wants to contrast Alexander to another commentator. So Alexander says P, but Porphyry says Q, then he'll tell you, right? But if it's just good commentary, he just quotes it without telling you where he got it. But if it's the pre-Socratics or Philoponus, someone he wants to cherish and preserve, or someone he wants to rubbish, then he'll tell you what the source is.
I guess the analogy in Latin scholasticism would be the concern with getting the translations right. And because, they developed all these shortcuts in the medieval university, especially in the early stages in the 13th century. The students sitting in the pews didn't have the books in front of them. The professor had the books. The students, if they wanted them, they had to copy them out by hand, or they could rent them from the library. You could rent a chunk of text from the library, but mostly the graduate students, the people in the higher faculties, law, medicine, and theology, who could own the books or could borrow the books from their own housing unit. So they had to memorize a lot of stuff, and a lot of the medieval university exercises are organized around memorizing texts. So you have the morning ordinatio lecture, which goes on for 3 hours, questions at the end. You have lunch, 10 o'clock in the morning. And then you have the repetitio in the afternoon, where the bachelor, the master's assistant, just goes over the text with you and pounds them into you. And then they develop these texts called auctoritates. The auctoritates Aristoteles, for example. And people have looked at these. I think Jacqueline Mess looked into these. years ago, they're not all that close to Aristotle. They're kind of philosopher's shorthand. This is the kind of thing Aristotle says about, sensation. And if you're getting into more precise philosophical work in theology faculty, that's not good enough. So that's one reason why Aquinas, hired or got his fellow Dominican Merbeka to redo the translations of Aristotle on a more on a more verbal basis. They had 3 separate translations of Aristotle's Ethics that were translated various times and conflicting terminology, and they needed a kind of standard terminology in order to discuss Aristotle's thought at a high level. They had to standardize the Bible. That was incredibly important for theologians. So the Paris had its own standard text. I think if I remember correctly, it's called the Litera Parisiensis, or Reductio, something like that. But it was kept in the Sorbonne Library. And if you wanted to work on the text of the Bible, you had to make your copies from that text. So maybe I'm wandering too far from the subject, but I'm just pointing out that the idea of authority and accurate citation is one that's closely connected with the idea of authority.
I'd love to, if I can, to move us a little bit to kind of the idea also of the role of politics throughout the ages, because we're sort of getting into these ideas of ethics within institutions and authority, and I think it does make quite a lot of insight to see sort of throughout the ages how original thought and authority have existed. But what about politics? Because I think that our current situation does involve a lot of politics. So what role does this sort of political aspects have in ethos in a research facility?
So,
maybe Jim, you can start. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of say something funny, which is that so often American cultural phenomena come to Germany, where I live, kind of late. But the Germans were way ahead of Americans on this because their politicians have been getting caught plagiarizing for years. So this has been actually, this seems to have been a real kind of almost like a maybe unstated policy that if you were just a young person in a hurry and wanted to make your political career, since in Germany it's still thought to be very sort of fancy to have a doctorate, like they like to call themselves doctor, right? And so a lot of the politicians clearly just tried to get a PhD very quickly, as easily as they could, so they plagiarized, and a whole bunch of them have been caught for doing this. Of course, the politicians of the future will just use ChatGPT, so they won't get caught. Actually, that's something else I was thinking, is that I feel like this discussion is sort of like having a chat about the ethics and history of radio in 1957, right? Like everyone's about to start using television, and radio is like already irrelevant, but we just don't know it yet. And plagiarism in the future will seem like an artifact of like the fact that people worried about plagiarism in the sense we're thinking about it, where you copy someone else's words, right? Why would anyone do that even now? Like an undergraduate who does that is really not up with the current technology. So I think this is like an issue of the past already to some extent.
Well, maybe the reproduction of somebody else's words is not going to be as important, but I think ideas and scientific credit for work that's done, that's still to me important. And also one of the other issues that came up with Claudine Gay was her refusal to share her data, which is something that is at odds with the ethos of a research university. If you will not share your data, then that means you can't be checked by anybody else, and that if you are rewarded for doing that, then there's a misallocation of resources. But I take your point, Peter, about AI changing everything. I think that's true. There's a man now, one of the men who came after Claudine Gay, a journalist. His name is Christopher Rufo. And there was somebody else who worked for a Washington newspaper, I forget which one, who found a lot of these supposedly plagiarized passages. He is now getting funding and threatening to go through the entire Harvard faculty's publications and search for plagiarism using the artificial intelligence helps. And I have a terrible worry. I like literary quotation. I like to allude to Shakespeare and Milton and the Bible and and I consider when I grew up, literary allusion was supposed to be recognized, right? So I'm living in fear that Christopher Rufo is going to run a program on something I wrote and say, he's stealing from Shakespeare, he's stealing from Milton.
Yeah.
That would be
Adamson used the
rude.
phrase, "May the force be with you," without acknowledging his source.
Yes, exactly. So that's
Yeah,
a worry.
actually, the mention of Chris Rufo is right on point to your question, Anya, because I mean, if people don't know who Chris Rufo is, something else he's notorious for is he's the guy who deliberately started the moral panic around critical race theory
Uh,
by so he plucked this obscure. Actually, I just did a podcast on critical race theory. It turns out to be extremely interesting and very subtle. And he sometimes I think this is just because there are two hard C's in the word critical, and so it sounds kind of scary. So he sort of he actually said openly, that's one of the good thing about Chris Rufo is that he has no intellectual integrity at all, but he's upfront about it. So he said deliberately, I'm going to brand. He actually used the verb brand. He's going to brand critical race theory as this kind of bogeyman and tar the left with all being critical race theorists, and of course it worked, right? So
yeah,
I think that, I mean, the fact that he latched on to plagiarism is kind of accidental because he's just the kind of guy who tries to dig up dirt on his political enemies as he sees them, right?
yeah,
And if he could have caught Claudine Gay, I don't know, embezzling money or cheating on her husband or whatever, then he would have done that instead. So I'm not sure that, I mean, obviously plagiarism is like um, considered to be extremely bad in academic circles,
yeah,
and so it's a very effective weapon to use against someone if you can catch them doing it. But I think ultimately it's just one kind of dirt you can dig up on someone who you want to take out. And the reason he targeted her, I guess, is because she had defended her students' right to criticize Israel in front of
yeah,
Congress.
yeah. I was never fully convinced by that because one of the persons she was supposed to have plagiarized was her own thesis advisor, Gary King, who in her thesis, she was supposed to have plagiarized her thesis advisor, Gary King. And I assume that Gary King read the thesis, so I would recognize his
One would
own
hope
prose.
so.
Yeah, so I don't know. I doubt whether that was an intent to deceive anybody.
Maybe he took it as a compliment.
Yeah.
She
Um,
also plagiarized some of the sentences in her acknowledgments.
Yeah, there were
yeah.
some stranger ones.
Yeah, I think maybe she just like when she saw phrasing, she's like that's good. And I was actually thinking about this. So let's consider an interesting hypothetical case. So let's say that I'm writing a philosophy article on some technical issue in philosophy, right? Like disjunctivism or something like that. And so I'm like, okay, well, I need to start out by giving a definition. So I go to, let's say, like a standard work on disjunctivism or the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is what everyone uses these days because it's there and it's easy and it's great. And so I take that definition and I just say, okay, I am going to define, or I'm going to take disjunctivism to mean the following, right? And I just
Yeah.
whack in the definition, right? So, and she did stuff like that, Claudine Gay, I take it.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't matter if she did, but let's consider the case. So I think it's actually not so clear why, like, what would be the harm in that. So certainly, if I were going to do that, I would cite the source personally, and
Yeah.
I would tell a student to cite the source. But it's very difficult to explain what the on any moral theory, whether you're utilitarian or a Kantian or whatever. I think it's very hard to explain what what would be bad about doing that. So if you just think it's a good definition,
Yeah.
Presumably the person who put forward the definition thinks it's a good definition. They should want other people to accept the definition. They think it's a good way to think about the topic. So in a sense, all you're doing is doing what they told you to, namely to take that to be the definition of the term, right? I mean, maybe this is
Yeah.
too easy an example, but I think that it shows that not every case of copying words or ideas for that matter, because I could paraphrase the definition as well without using exactly the same words, right? It's
Yeah.
not at all clear that there's anything wrong happening there. And maybe when we cite, when we're doing that, we're just kind of erring on the side of citing,
Yeah.
unless the thought is, well, the person who came up with this very elegant definition should get credit, right? And then we're
Right.
back to incentive structures, right? But
Well,
I'm worried about a critique of plagiarism that bases it all on nothing but incentive structures. So if it's all about the idea that knowledge is it sort of belong or ways of putting things belongs to people, then that makes me think that we're comparing academic work to something like a patent in scientific invention or something. Whereas,
yeah.
you know, one would like to think that academic work, at least in the humanities, is about furthering knowledge or something like that. And that's what we should be targeting, and not just, you know, getting tenure or whatever it is.
And to me, it's also a literary issue because, you know, someone who is a trying to be a good writer or even an excellent, outstanding writer develops their own way of talking, their own way of putting things. They have a kind of house style, which, you know, if they're a good writer, they're constantly trying to improve or vary. And it's kind of it's not a copyright, but it is a way of expressing oneself. You know, when you read Macaulay in the 19th century, you know, he has a very distinctive style. And if somebody starts plagiarizing Macaulay, you can guess where it's going to come from. And that, to me, I'm not sure that's ethically a problem. I think it's more of a personal moral weakness that you would want to use somebody else's language instead of coming up with something like of your own. Now, I'm meeting this issue every single day because I'm writing a history of the Western tradition. And
Modest aim.
a modest thing. I'm only going to 1500. I have a co-author who's doing 15. I'm doing the first 3,000 years, and he's doing the last 500. So I'm constantly, you know, using other people's work because I'm writing a narrative, and the narrative obviously takes account of what previous scholars have done. But occasionally I have to decide that this person really needs to be acknowledged here. And it's a fine line. You know, I'm using some ideas, for example, from Kyle Harper, who's a very brilliant ancient historian, who's written a lot about climate change in history. And when I get to climate change, I think, you know, and it's partly fear that some people recognize that I'm stealing from him. That's, I think, I'm not really worried about that, but I'm not stealing from him. Everything I write comes through my brain and is expressed in my own words. But some of the ideas are coming from other people. And it's very difficult to decide when you acknowledge them. And what I'm finding is that if these ideas have been put forward by scholars who are still living, or recent scholars, then I will feel a greater urge to acknowledge them, their ideas, not their language. But if it's, you know, J.B. Bury in the 19th century or Gibbon, well, Gibbon I would probably acknowledge just, or, you know, some more obscure, if there's some given of historical interpretation that dates 50 years back, I don't feel such an obligation to acknowledge the first person who came up with you know, the formula that of Heraclius that the Son of God beats the God of the Sun. Anyway, so it's not a clear cut I'm not sure I would call that would even qualify as plagiarism. I think I would really like to know, I wonder if anyone here in this audience knows when the modern mania for considering plagiarism to be the unforgivable sin, right? When that really comes into academic practice, because it's been that way my entire life. I was warned in the cradle, as it were, the academic cradle, that I shouldn't plagiarize and I should put quotation marks and citation. We're taught all these methods of documentation. And that's important to do this. So that goes back, my academic careers, it goes back, for 50 years. But I'm not sure how far it goes back and under what circumstances it first became a big concern to academics to ferret out plagiarism and to make sure that people don't plagiarize.
Previously, Peter, you mentioned the idea of, the economic incentive for being sort of an underlying pin of originality versus plagiarism. But I think another major trend, and to answer your question, Jim, is sort of just the rise of a very individualistic culture and society that focuses much more on the individual's name and pride, and that when I think of kind of the earlier medieval time periods and such, you sort of have more of a community culture with regards to God, and submitting the sense of the ego and the individual on behalf of the community. And I think you would find, if you were sort of anthropologically kind of going to cross-reference that with cultures and tribes or African proverbs versus, really focusing on an individual author, that in our sort of very Western society, the more and more individualistic it gets, the more and more the ownership of one's own ideas becomes more important. I
think that's right. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
I think that's right. And actually, I think so. Sometimes people talk about the 16th century also as the rise as the time where individualism comes in, right? They inevitably mention Hamlet, right? But they're like, Stephen Greenblatt, people like this, they talk about this is sort of the birth of individualism. And if you think about the humanists, they were a lot more like modern day academics than they were like your communitarian scholastics and or African proverb writers, so they were like trying to make a name for themselves. Actually, an interesting thing that I like to talk about sometimes is the fact that humanism allows women to come into intellectual discourse for the first time as individual speakers who actually have something to say rather than being mouthpieces for a mystical vision of God, right? Because they can learn really good Latin too. So Laura Cereto or someone like that will come out and say, well, look, I can write Latin. look how good my Latin is. And so I can be a famous humanist too. And it works in a few cases.
Yeah. Humanism is much more open to female participation than scholasticism. You can't be a female in the university.
Can't be less open to female participation in scholastics.
Now, there's a famous case in the University of Vienna in the late 14th century where a woman dressed up as a man and attended classes, and she was exposed literally, and they made her, they tore off her gown and made her dance on top of the table in the dining hall to show that she was a whore and all this kind of thing. It was really, really disgusting. But that it's quite the opposite in the humanist culture. The humanists want to have especially upper class women involved in the movement because that gives them more cachet. But I just realized one thing that I completely overlooked about plagiarism, which is textual criticism. And I encountered this recently when we edited the Miscellanea of Poliziano, who's the great textual critic of the Renaissance. Tony Grafton wrote 2 volumes about him. And he was very interested in amending classical texts, and there was endless fighting. This guy is really he's kind of bitchy, frankly, if I may put it this way. He's a great critic, and I admire his scholarship. He's an amazing, first of the great philologists, really. But he does not want anyone to take credit for his emendations. Like, he has amended the text of Juvenal, and somebody else has used his emendations without giving him credit. And that's really one of the first instances I can think of plagiarism in the humanist movement, where they really are trying, they want to fix up these texts. They want these ancient texts to be the original voice of the author, and they want to take credit for restoring the ancient voice. And if anybody else tries to take credit for it, then maybe that's the first example of academic a structure of incentives, because these guys are all giving lectures in the city of Rome, city of Florence, city of Milan, and they get jobs based on their brilliance as textual emenders. They get patronage. So there you can find it. I should have mentioned this long ago in our discussion. Actually, it's just came into my head now. But if we're going to date the beginning of plagiarism or a structure of academic incentives that gives plagiarism a certain salience, maybe we should go back to the late 15th century.
Yeah, you can also do it. You can find Renaissance examples for the sciences. So in addition to the people I was mentioning before, Tycho Brahe, who's, to be fair, about 100 years later than what you're saying. So
Yeah.
he makes all these observations with his incredible instruments. And then there's a fight over the documents and who will get to use them, right? So
Yeah.
I guess Kepler spends a long time fighting with the executors of his papers, which is his family, I suppose, trying to get his hands on the data so that he can then basically defend a sort of neo-Copernican cosmology on that basis.
Yeah.
So it happens in the physical sciences as well as in something like philology. And these are, I mean, we keep seeing this. So there's this, I think this is the reason I keep mentioning the 15th and 16th century is that this is the period I've been covering in my podcast for the last few years. So I'm thinking about it all the time. And it's amazing how many things happened at the same time, many of which contribute to our conception of plagiarism. So like I said, the printing press, individualism, the idea of patents, the idea of individual scholars who are independent because they have patronage or because they're independently wealthy, like Pico della Miranda.
Yep.
That all happens in the 16th century, 15th, 16th century. It makes it very different from the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries.
Yeah, the printing press in particular, the idea of academic credit is very relevant to that, because especially in classical texts, they always have a title page, which amazes modern people how verbose they are. They don't have short titles in the 16th century, or if you have to make short titles in the 16th century. They have titles that fill the entire page. But the reason for that is these books were not sold in bound. They were displayed in boxes in front of the booksellers' shops, so that people wandering down the street could look at the title page. They didn't have to open the book, it was right there in the box, and they could see what was being offered by the printer. So the printer will say, works of Plato, the complete works of Plato, more complete than ever before. We've included these texts which the previous printer has left out. We have the latest text because of someone's found a manuscript somewhere. We've collated that. Usually it's a printed edition, but never mind. And we have a great index. They always say that, the local index local platissimos, you can find anything you want in our index. This is all in the title page, which is in the box. And then you buy the unbound sheets and you take it down the street to the bookbinder and have them bind it. And maybe decorate it if you're so inclined. But it's that is also a context in which there's competition to produce original material and philological material.
Can I share my favorite early modern title, even though it's completely irrelevant? But I promise you it's funny.
Please.
So there's this magician philosopher, Robert Flood, turn of the 17th century, right? And he defended the possibility of a magical technique for curing wounds called the weapon salve. And the weapon salve was attacked by someone named Parson William Foster, who wrote a book called A Sponge to Wipe Away the Weapon Solve, to which Flood responded with a work called Dr. Flood's Answer to Foster, or The Squeezing of Parson Foster's Sponge. Isn't that great?
I like, I
No,
like
they
that.
Sorry,
cer-
that wasn't
certainly,
relevant, but
no, they're
couldn't-
certainly
I
creative.
could not mention it.
Now, I want to say, Jim and Peter, we are kind of getting closer to the end of our sort of allotted time. So I wanted to sort of end with question in the other direction, because we've been spending a lot of time talking about the past, and there have been a lot of references both in the chat and the commentary and from both of you too as well, about what the future of universities will be like. And, you know, both of you are very steeped in academia. And we've had these issues with plagiarism. There's also been sort of accounts of free speech. There's this AI, ChatGPT. Do you think the kind of higher learning institutions will be able to recover from this situation, or are they sort of ripe for disruption, or should they have disruption?
Jim, what do you think?
You're letting me go first.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
you know I am.
I like to end on the easy ones,
Yeah.
right?
On the more conservative side of the spectrum, there's a big debate about whether they should try to reform existing institutions or to create new institutions. And they're doing both. I prefer, I've been at Harvard my entire life. I've been there 38 years, and I liked the Harvard of my youth. I don't want to be a laudator temporosacti, but I like the Harvard of my youth much more than I like the Harvard now, which is much more, a lot more people who are afraid to talk. That's a bad thing. So my hope is that the university will recover its telos, and which is the discovery of truth, and freedom of expression and freedom of thought and open debate. I think there is some signs of people who at Harvard, we have a group of people called the Council on Academic Freedom, 170 professors who've gotten together and decided they don't like the direction of the university. And these people are left, right, and center. In fact, they're more left than there are. Well, they're not conservatives at Harvard, but there are sort of radical progressives, there are mild progressives, there are center left people. And these people, represent a spectrum politically, but they all hold in common. And I have to admit, we're all older generation people. Most of us are old generation, 40s and up, who want to see the university concentrate on what it does best and what it's designed to do. And furthermore, we're aware of what our predecessors in our departments did, some of the great figures there. We're aware that many generous donors for a century have given money hoping to accomplish certain things through the university. And a lot of those people their purposes are being frustrated. And I don't say that everything that a donor wants should be done. Nevertheless, Harvard University had a certain ethos, a certain set of purposes, especially since the Second World War. And people gave money to support those things. And I don't like it when the university thinks that it's, or at least some people in the university think that it's the job of the university to engage in partisan politics. When I first came into the history department, I was hired as an assistant professor in 1985. I had no idea what anybody's politics were. I really didn't know. It took me about 10 years to figure out where people were on the spectrum. We just never talked about it. It didn't come up. And it was never an issue in someone's promotion or hiring. And recently I'm starting to hear people in department meetings say, well, I can't vote for that person. I can't stand his politics. And that to me is new, and it's not good. Maybe there should be exceptions made for people who have really, really obscene politics, but I'm hoping that the traditional, that the old universities will return somehow to their to their older vision of what a university is for. And I doubt very much that new institutions will be able to replace the old institutions. There's something called the first mover advantage, which is very strong in education, meaning that the first entrant into the field tends to stay first. So Oxford and Cambridge universities were the top universities in England in the 13th century, and they still are. You know, Harvard was the first university in America, and it's still, you know, near the top, if not the top. University of Paris is still the major institution in France. It's very hard to break into that rank ordering. So I don't have much confidence in new institutions. So my hope, which I don't dare say it's a prediction, but my hope is that it will move to its traditional purposes, which do not necessarily mean the support of conservative causes. In fact, shouldn't mean that, but it means that we do what we're trained to do, which is to do scholarship in science.
So I guess my perspective on this is unusual in that I've been in university contexts in the States, the UK, and now Germany. So I got my BA and my PhD at Williams College and then Notre Dame. That was where I got my doctorate. Then I worked at King's College London for 12 years. And as you said at the beginning, I'm still connected to them, but my main job is here in Munich now at the LMU in Munich. So I've seen from the inside private university, or actually a private liberal arts college, Williams, private research university, Notre Dame, then a public university which became more capitalist, so to speak, because of the introduction of high tuition fees a few years before I left, which changed everything overnight in British academia in ways that I think are 99% pernicious. So they managed to sort of get the worst of both worlds, and I think most British academics would agree with that. And now I'm in Germany, where it's still a private university, and it's very different. So, I mean, I think all universities provide a kind of gatekeeping function, which is that's a phrase that's usually used pejoratively, but I don't necessarily mean it pejoratively, right? So if you're a professor at a university, that's supposed to mean that you know something and that you're good at communicating it in teaching and research. And it's connected to a lot of other gatekeeping processes, for example, publication in esteemed journals, right? So it's an interesting question. So we didn't talk very much about the publishing industry, which is obviously connected to plagiarism. So because when you steal something, so when you steal text or the ideas of a text, what you're stealing is something that was often published with an effort to make money, right? And as you know, you could do a whole another show on this, how that's sort of breaking down because of things like the drive towards open access, the fact that if you have any facility with the internet at all, you can find pretty much any book as a free PDF online and so on, right? So that whole model in a way doesn't work anymore, but in a way it does, because even if Oxford University Press has a hard time making money off their books, it still means something to have your book come out with Oxford University Press. And and it's not the same to just put it up on the internet for free. That's why people don't do it, right? So that, in fact, we don't just want people to read our books, because if we wanted to do that, we could just publish them on the internet, right? And tell everyone on Twitter. The reason we publish with publishers is because we want the gatekeeping function, right? We want to say this has a kind of a premature of quality. So that's true across the board. But I think the thing that's different in Germany, and maybe this might be true of some state schools in the United States, but I was never at a state school, so I don't know very well, is that a big public research university in Germany is in fact a public resource. So anyone can come in and sit down in the lectures. We are civil servants. The professors are civil servants, and we work for the government and hence for the people. And that sounds kind of like idealist and sort of whatever, but you really feel it. You feel that it's true. You also feel very much that the students don't pay tuition fees, right? So it's kind of all very low key, right? They're kind of here, they're doing their degree, with some degree of enthusiasm, but it's kind of up to them, right? Because they're not paying thousands and thousands of euros a year to do it. But on the other hand, they don't get this sort of lavish attention that you would expect as a customer of a school like Harvard, right? So it's almost like a utility, right? And I think that, I mean, we don't have time here to get into the relative merits of these different kinds of universities, but I think it's the reason I'm mentioning this in answer to your question is that I think it maybe reminds us of something that we could easily forget, which is that globally, and of course we haven't even talked about, you know, universities in the Islamic world or China or whatever, and Chinese universities are going to be increasingly important in the next decades for sure. There are many different models of universities. How do they relate to the state? How are they funded? Are they based on teaching primarily, like Williams, where I got my BA, or are they geared primarily around research, like Harvard or the LMU? So these are all things that are already quite diverse. So it's not like there's just one kind of university, the Humboldtian university, and that's what we always have in all these different places. Actually, places like Harvard and the LMU are very much the exception. This is not where most people get their university degrees, and it's also not where most academics teach, right? So I think we should, before we start sort of thinking about the future of the university, we should think about the complexity of the higher education ecosystem that already exists across even just Europe and North America, never mind the whole world, where, you know, probably no one has an understanding of how diverse and complicated that is.
Yeah, I must say, you know, I'm down here at the end of the world in Argentina, and you know, they've just finished 75 years of Peronism and socialism and elected an anarchist as their leader, and things are changing very quickly. So it is interesting to say that the world, you never know what changes can happen. If you had told me 5 years ago that this would be a country where people voted in an anarchist, I would have laughed, you know. So it's just interesting because you can have these long-standing institutions and systems that can change very rapidly. So I think it is important for us to talk about what ethics should be in institutions and how we can preserve them if those are the institutions we want to preserve. So I want to thank you both for joining me today to talk about plagiarism and authority and the originality of thought, and the, you know, there's so much interesting topics, and I know our audience was jumping in with comments and ideas and references. So I want to thank this excellent audience as well. It's always a pleasure to have our classical wisdom community join us, and we'll be posting this online for anybody who couldn't join us live, as well as links to your relevant books. And I want to just say thank you again to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Good to see you both. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you all.